Our next speaker is Stephen Salzberg, who is a professor of medicine and the director of the Center for Computational Biology at Johns Hopkins, and he's our number one. Thank you.
Thanks. So I have a very different perspective, so I'll try to change the way I present things a little bit. I'm a basic scientist in most of what I do. I've been involved a lot in open access to genome data, and that's why I was invited to talk to you today. Genome data is a little different from clinical trials data, but only a little different. Really, a lot of the issues are the same. And so I've been involved in trying in my community for quite a few years now to open up scientific work and encourage more sharing of results. So broadly speaking, I think we should do science in a very open way. And it seems like everyone would agree with this, but when you start getting into the details, you discover that many people, including many scientists, resist it. So what I'd like to get across today, though, is that there's been a real sea change over the last 10 or 12 years, at least in my field, and I'm hoping this will happen in the clinical trials world, although they're quite a bit behind where we are in genomics. So there's really three aspects of open science as I do it. I'm a computational biologist. I do computational analysis of DNA sequences, of genome data. So we develop software and new methods, and we also generate lots and lots of very large data sets. I'm sure you all know about the Human Genome Project, which is how I sort of got into the field. There are now genome projects for thousands of different species going on around the world, ranging from viruses and bacteria to animals. There. And it's gotten, because of revolutionary changes in technology, it's gotten very easy to do DNA sequencing and to generate huge amounts of data. And then, so I've encouraged in the open science model, I encourage my colleagues, and I practice myself, people to release all their software for free, to release all their data for free, and to publish their work in open access journals. And I'll say more about that in a minute. So why do this? Well, basically, as a scientist, if you do science in an open way, things move faster. And the reason that we do science is because we want to make progress in a particular field. We're all drawn to a field because we're captivated by the problems and we would like to solve those problems. In some respects, if you don't publish your science, you haven't really done it. So if I did a scientific experiment and never told anybody, what would be the point? So everyone who does science wants to tell everybody at some point. The only question is, when do they want to tell them? So let me start by just talking a little bit about open access publication, which is one of these three areas of open science. So this is an area that really caught on and got traction because of the internet, not because of anything to do with science. So open access publication refers to the notion that when I publish a paper, anybody who wants to can read that paper and in fact share that paper with other people. There's no restrictions on essentially making copies of it and sending it around. So there's no copyright issues with it. And there are now hundreds of journals that have an open access policy. So you publish your paper in these journals and anyone can read them. Now most of you, if you've ever tried to look up a paper about a topic you care about, you've probably encountered a paywall. You find the paper on PubMed, you click the link, it goes to the journal website, and you can read like the first half of the abstract, and then if you want any more, you have to pay $35 or $50 something to see the paper. Now, no one ever really knew about this until the early mid-90s when the internet caught on. And until then, journal publishers are very happily doing their business the way they always have. They have been very resistant to changing the way they do business, although today, most papers are published and distributed online. You do get hard copies of journal papers now and then, but I never read hard copies anymore. And most people I know don't either, except some of the older scientists, older than me. So the journal publishers can, of course, distribute material for a far lower cost than they ever had before, but they didn't really like the notion of cutting of lowering their prices. And scientists started to realize back in the late 90s that, look, we write the papers, so all these papers that you're trying to read, we review the papers. Scientific papers are all peer-reviewed, or good ones are peer-reviewed by editors and reviewers who are people like me. And the public actually pays for the research. Almost all scientific research, not all, but the vast majority of scientific research is publicly funded. And then, in the end, when you publish the paper, until not long ago, you would publish it in a privately owned journal, or some journals owned by scientific societies, but you would sign over the copyright. So you no longer had the right to distribute your own paper. You signed it over, even though the government might have paid, and there's one estimate made about 10 years ago that the typical NIH study costs over $200,000 per paper. So the government has spent over $200,000 to produce this paper, and then an author, a scientist, just signs over the copyright to Elsevier or Kluwer or some journal publisher, and then they make a profit on those papers. Of course, it's very profitable for them. They don't have to do anything except format it and then sell it. So that's changed, and one reason that's changed is that many open access journals were created because it's easy to do that now. And open access journals there's a new copyright policy. There's actually several of them you can use, but more sort of dramatic was a change just a few years ago when, after many years of attempts, Congress various groups finally got Congress to pass a bill that required that any research that is funded by the NIH has to be published not in an open access journal, but has to be put into a public repository called PubMed Central. So they had to work out a lot of details to do this. So you can publish it in a closed access journal, but the journal has to allow you to put your paper into PubMed Central, which is unrestricted. Now, the publishers groups hated that, and they lobbied against it furiously, and unfortunately the head of NIH kind of knuckled under, and that was delayed by several years. And finally, the policy as it is today is that you actually get a 12-month, the journals get a 12-month delay. So you can put the paper into PubMed Central right away, but the government only requires you to do it within 12 months. But at least we get the papers within 12 months. And then just more recently, in the past couple of years, finally, the National Science Foundation adopted the same policy, and other federal agencies are adopting the same policy. It was initially NIH. And you might think, well, this is great, and scientists like me were pushing for this as hard as we could. But honestly, scientists were not the reason that this was successful. I wish it were true. I wish we were all so altruistic about sharing our results. But scientists are essentially wimpy when it comes to changing policy, and they're all afraid that the journals will get mad at them if they agitate too much. No kidding, they are afraid of this. And because when you're a scientist and you're trying to get a paper published, especially early in your career, you will do anything the journal says. And so the journals say, we don't like open access, but if you want to publish in our journal, then this is our rule, and scientists will do whatever they say. What happened was actually patient groups increasingly discovered these paywalls, and patient groups for various diseases discovered that, hey, I care about breast cancer, and there are these papers about breast cancer based on these studies that I paid for, and we want to read them. We don't want to have to go and pay another $35 each time we see an abstract that might be interesting. And those groups were much more effective than the scientific groups. The scientific groups came online and supported the policies, but they weren't really what made it happen. So that's been very successful. However, there's still many journals that are not open access. But the leading journals are either open access, or all of them, of course, once this policy was put in place by NIH, all of them agreed that they would allow authors to do that. So if you publish a paper in New England Journal of Medicine or JAMA or Science or Nature, those are sort of the leading journals across science, they're not open access journals, but they will allow you to put the paper into PubMed Central within 12 months, because they know if they said no, their pipeline of papers would dry up. This group probably not that interested in software, but the same issue applies to software. There isn't any policy from the government on sharing software. My group shares all of our software. These are just a few of the systems we developed for DNA sequence analysis. All of them are free, open access software, meaning anybody can use them. You can change the code. You can redistribute the code just as you could redistribute a paper that we publish. And this, in my world, this gets the software more widely adopted, and it actually accelerates the science. And that, for a scientist, is one of the most compelling arguments. By sharing your materials and sharing your papers, your data, and your software, you make science move faster. Obviously, you make it move faster. Now, I'm skipping one of the big threats here, and the reason for the resistance in the scientific community, which Peter alluded to, is that scientists want to publish as many papers as we can. That's what we do. Our currency is the papers that we publish. We have to get funding for our work. If you publish a lot of papers, you're more likely to get funding. So if you sit on your data and your methods and you don't let anybody else have them, you can sort of mine them for more results. So it might, in some selfish way, be a little bit more in your interest to not share. I haven't taken that approach, but there's certainly people who do. So let me just talk about finally spend probably the most time on this third topic, which is sharing data. So genome data has been, most of the time, is shared in a very open way since the Human Genome Project really reached its final stages. And there was a real cultural shift. So these two journal covers are the covers of the journal Science and Nature in February of 2001 when the Human Genome was published. And for those who don't know or remember this, there was a simultaneous publication in these two journals. On the left was the publication of a private group led by a company here in Rockville, Maryland, Celera Genomics, that sequenced the genome in a big race against the publicly funded groups, which published their paper in Nature. And in interest of disclosure, I was part of the group on the left. I wasn't at that company, but I collaborated with them because I'd been working on the human genome for years, and I wanted to be part of one of the papers, and you had to kind of pick your sides. They're actually buried in the author list. There's one person who's on both, but generally the author lists are not overlapping. So in the late 90s, in 1998 specifically, when this company was formed to sequence the human genome and race to the finish, at that point the Human Genome Project had been going on since 1989. It was a large international effort with many countries, many centers in the U.S. involved. And it was supposed to be done in 2005. Now these were 2001. And this company, Celera, was led by a fairly charismatic guy named Craig Venter, who is great with the media, and he went on TV and radio and in the print media right away saying they were going to do this, and they were going to beat the human genome publicly funded groups to the finish line. They were going to be finished in 2003. He said this, actually, I was working with him at the time, so I was very much a part of it. He made all these claims before they'd done anything. Actually, the company didn't even have a name when he was making these claims. So, but Francis Collins, who was the head of the Human Genome Project at the time, now he's the head of all of NIH, thought it was fairly credible, as did others, and it was very credible. So they really rapidly reorganized the public effort to speed it up. But what they also did at the time was there was a lot of concern that this private company would start to patent a lot of genes and file other intellectual property claims on all the sequences in the human genome. So at that time, in 1998, they said, well, you know, they had not been doing this before, but the public groups announced they would now be releasing their data continually throughout the rest of the project. Within 24 hours, usually it wasn't quite that fast, but within 24 hours of generating the data, they would release it. So this would be years before it was published. Now, so there was really an outside impetus making them do this. They were trying to undermine what Celera Genomics was doing. But whatever the motivation, the result was a good thing. So interestingly, though, so they did that. There was an archive set up at NIH for this data to be deposited. And what happened was this really caused a cultural shift in the genomics world. And from that point on, essentially every sequencing project, every genomics project that NIH funded followed the same policy. Even though there was no race going on, there was no commercial company that was racing the project of sequencing the mouse genome and the chimp genome and hundreds of bacterial genomes that have been sequenced and hundreds of viral genomes that have been sequenced. There was no commercial entity out there competing, but it just became part of, this is how it works. You want to do genome sequencing, and you put the data in this thing called the Trace Archive. It's now called the Sequence Read Archive, where it's available for anyone with no restrictions right away. So scientists don't always like to do that. Even the genome scientists who were in this race didn't really like it, but NIH required it. The policy, as I just said, it isn't really quite what it was. It isn't really quite what I just said it was. This is a letter that I wrote with 3 of my colleagues to the journal Nature about 10 years ago about free access to data. And there's just one quote from the letter where we said, because the policy didn't quite go far enough, we felt, and still doesn't, but it's very close to this, that we, in our view, data sets from large, centralized, expensive genome data collection projects should be freely available to the entire scientific community immediately and with no restrictions or conditions. And that's more or less what the policy is. Not that, I don't want to go into the details of the caveats, although if you have questions I can explain the exceptions. But essentially, we, the taxpayers, are funding all of these projects. And it's not just in the interest of science, but it's in the interest of the public in general that this data be shared quickly and without restriction, because science will go faster. The reason it's getting public funding is that science has some benefit to the community. So it's, of course, a benefit if the science moves more quickly. So I only have about a minute and a half left. Let me just give you one quick example. So there's many thousands of genomes that have been completed under this model. I've worked on some of them. I'm going to skip because I don't have time. I want to talk about the flu for a minute and a half. I started a project when I was at the Institute for Genomic Research about 10 years ago to sequence flu genomes. And the goal of this project was, the flu genome is tiny, you can sequence it very easily. The goal of this project was to sequence thousands of genomes, not just one, but many, to get a picture of the population of the flu virus itself so we could keep ahead of it a little bit more accurately in developing vaccines, which, as you know, we develop a new vaccine every year. That project is still ongoing. When we started, there were 7 flu genomes that have been sequenced. As of today, there's over 10,000. And so every year we sequence new strains that are emerging and many isolates of those strains. But with the flu community, it wasn't really the genomics community, and we met a lot of resistance. So this is my last slide because I only have 1 minute left. This is an editorial I wrote for Nature a few years ago about the struggle to get flu researchers, scientists, who presumably are doing research because they want to cure the flu or they want to prevent the flu. But nonetheless, we had a lot of trouble getting them to contribute samples to this project. Even though we said we will sequence the samples for you for free, but the condition of that was that we'll sequence them for you for free, just send us the isolates. But we will put them into this public archive immediately with no restrictions, meaning if you don't write your paper quickly, someone else might. And so that's still an ongoing struggle, and even though the flu is constantly in the public eye, if you hear about sharing of data and samples from flu people, they will always say the right things. But behind the scenes, they're not really sharing data right now. It's a continuing struggle. So genomics has been converted. Open access publishing, things are going very well. But it's a new battle with each community that we confront. And I'm out of time, so I'll stop there. Thanks.